In 1978, Grenada's Prime Minister Sir Eric Gairy brought UFOs to the floor of the United Nations, backed by researchers like Jacques Vallée and J. Hynek. Their goal? A global investigation into UAPs. But despite their efforts, the United Nations dismissed the initiative, citing political and scientific resistance. Today, an interest in UAPs surges worldwide. We ask, was Gairy ahead of his time? Should the UN revisit the issue now? And what would it take for global cooperation on this mystery in the skies? I sat down with Jacques Vallée, astrophysicist, computer scientist, author, and UAP researcher, to speak about the first United Nations meeting he attended in 1978, along with the current efforts happening now to one day make this a reality. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. Jacques, thank you so much for joining me again on Rebelliously Curious. We've spoken a couple times, and we usually talk about current events, or we obviously do talk about the past, or we've talked about AI. But this time I want to go back to the 1970s and a conversation that has been trickling and starting again over and over again the past couple of years. But I really feel that it's something important that needs to be addressed. And in the 1970s, you were sitting down with Grenada, the country, and with the United Nations, addressing why the United Nations should take UAP seriously. But first of all, thank you for joining me back on the podcast.
Well, thank you for asking me this. It was kind of a surprise. The topic of trying to engage the UN comes up, again and again. It is definitely time for major nations to sit together and look at this not as a problem for an individual country like we tend to do in the US, but we need to learn from what other countries have learned, and we need to coordinate what we might do as a response to the phenomenon. I mean, we do it for everything else, in medicine and in everything else. However, you're bringing me back to the days of my youth, and but I do remember that those sessions very, very well. I've, of course, continued to discuss them, with people who were there, especially Lee Spiegel, who unfortunately died last year. And he was really the soul of the whole proceeding. He was a young man, a young reporter in New York, very ambitious, but also very respectful of the subject and of witnesses. And he felt deeply that the UN should be involved. Now, in discussing, going to the UN, of course, the subject has come up again and again, as you know, and you've been part of some of that. But you cannot get the UN to do anything. The UN is an assembly of sovereign nations, and they do what the sovereign nations want to do. You cannot go to a member of the UN and demand that they put a question before the General Assembly. That has to come from them individually, but you can prepare statements that you would circulate to the member nations, and the member nations would discuss it and would discuss how to bring it up to the General Assembly, which is the amazing thing that that Lee Spiegel managed to do essentially by himself. And he approached the Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, who said, well, if you want to do this, go talk to the different offices in New York of representing those countries and see who is interested. And he found that there was very little response, but there was one member nation, a small island in the Atlantic called Grenada, where he had met the leader of Grenada at an earlier UFO meeting in Mexico, in Acapulco, where Dr. Hynek and I were, and a number of other people. And the leader of Grenada, Sir Eric Gairy, was there as well and made a very emotional speech about UFOs. So he found that Sir Eric was prepared to present the question of the UN taking a look at the UFO problem before the General Assembly. Every nation, every member nation has the right once a year to stand up and make a comment to the General Assembly on anything they want. It could be on religion, it could be asserting a belief in something, it could be a statement about expressing the spirit of their country, or it could be a political proposal. And Sir Eric agreed to do that. They went to Kurt Waldheim and looked for a place to put it on the agenda. And that was the beginning of 3 days, actually, of tumultuous discussions among the people who were there. On the U.S. side, there was, of course, Dr. Alan Hynek and myself. There was an Army helicopter pilot, Major Coyne, was Captain Coyne at the time, and Major Coyne later. There was psychologist and great statistician David Saunders, who had been part of the University of Colorado study, and then there was Stanton Friedman and also astronaut Gordon Cooper, who attended the meetings. So on the French side, Dr. Claude Poher, with whom I worked in France quite a bit, exchanging our data, was there as well. And it was a fascinating meeting. Different countries expressed interest in following the proceedings, and we were asked to prepare a briefing for the General Assembly of the United Nations, which was done primarily by Lee Spiegel, who had actually pre-recorded a video, as well as Stanton Friedman. So those were played as background information for the members. I think that was the setting.
It's unbelievable. And there's photos that I'll be clipping into this interview as well, so people can see from the past. It's so interesting that you have the Prime Minister in Grenada who is deeply interested in UFOs. right? Coming together with people within North America and scientists and astronauts and reporters and people that feel that this topic is so important and presenting this to the United Nations. After this assembly and all of these amazing people and countries that have come together and said, we need to take this seriously, what did the United Nations decide? Obviously, we know that they didn't decide to move forward with it, but what was the conversation they had that you heard after you're addressing them with the information and the data? What did they say to you? Because they obviously said no. And was there a reason why?
So the proceedings were formal, and you can see that on the photographs that have survived. The subject, of course, was introduced by Mr. Waldheim, and then the floor belonged to Grenada, and the two of the leaders of Grenada made the introductory statements, including Sir Eric, and then he introduced the participants, and several of us made presentations. I made a very brief 2-page presentation that was, and I've been criticized for not diving into evidence, but the problem was not the evidence, was all in the background. I mean, we supplied briefing papers and everything else, and the video presentations as well. The point was, why should the UN, as a special body of 173 nations or something like that, take an interest and study a phenomenon like this? And so my presentation was about the larger issues in the world, that there were many sources of conflict, there were many differences among dominant religions, dominant civilizations around the world. And of course, some countries were very powerful with new technology and some were not. But the UFO presence, UFO phenomenon, whatever it was, I made no proposition about the nature of it, but was really calling all of that into question, all of us around the planet. This potentially was something from another planet or another civilization in the universe. And so this was, in fact, to be brought to the door of the UN, which we as scientists could not do. But the member nation could get everybody together. And I must tell you, this is something I will never forget. I mean, the room of the political committee of the United Nations in New York is in terms of architecture, it's very striking. It's an extraordinary room. It's a very large room. You have, the room for the delegations of all those countries with all the electronics, with screens and everything else. So it was certainly one of the most intimidating presentations I've ever had to make. Dr. Hynek spoke as, the American astronomer who was in charge of following the phenomenon on behalf of the American Air Force. So there was, a lot of interest in what he said. But the most, I think, the deepest impression was made by Captain Coyne, who was an Army officer, who described what had happened to him. And there was, you could have heard a pin drop. in this enormous, cavern, this enormous room. Everybody was mesmerized because he was a very humble man. He was very simple. He was doing his duty at the time, piloting a large helicopter. Those are the large helicopters with two rotors and that could lift large weights and so on. He was with half a dozen colleagues and they had just come back from a visual test because all of them were helicopter pilots, all of them were officers in the Army and of significant rank. And all of them had passed their visual test, to enable them to continue to serve as pilots, for the Army. So the idea that, this was a reflection and, you had myopia or your glasses didn't work, that was, which is very often what the skeptics will say. Your glasses were not, they said that in Socorro about the, the patrolman who saw a UFO. They said, well, your glasses were not good. There was no question about they had all passed and they could all continue to pilot helicopters for the Army. They saw a light ahead of them. They were coming back to their base in Ohio. The light got bigger. They didn't know, they had no idea what it was. The light placed itself above the helicopter and seemed to be coming towards as a collision course with the helicopter. When he described that, the entire, United Nations Political Committee was dead silent because obviously he was describing something that was extremely dangerous. He said, I tried to dive to avoid the collision. And then I looked at my altimeter and the helicopter was going up 2,000 feet a minute. And the collective was all the way into the position of diving, essentially of emergency diving. And the light above the helicopter was lifting it. Somebody couldn't stand what he was saying and asked, what did you do at that point, Captain? And he said, sir, I closed my eyes and prepared to die. Okay, this is not somebody who is, presenting himself as some sort of hero. He's an Army officer. He's seen death close to him before. He knows that there are certain conditions where, your life is over. And he thought that was such a condition. And then the light receded and he regained control of the collective and he landed, he went on to his base and he landed there. There was nothing wrong with the helicopter. And this light was never explained, And that, I think, made more impact on the assembly than anything that Dr. Hynek could have said, anything that Stanton Friedman could have said, and anything that Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, could have said. Certainly more than whatever I could have said. I mean, there was stunned silence. And I think the impact was incredible. I think there are, all that has been recorded. So this could be reshown again. I mean, this is certainly one of there was absolutely no question after the Army investigation, that this was completely unidentified and could have put the lives of, half a dozen Army officers in grave danger, because they did not control their helicopter. The helicopter was being lifted and, lifted up at a high rate when everything in the controls was to dive.
Right. And with such a compelling story, with everyone silent in the room listening to him and this pilot and his experience, and the UN being taken back, why did the UN leave and say no, that they would not put forward any UAP initiative?
So the UN is a servant to the wills of the assembled nations. And a number of nations are more equal than others because they are members of the Supreme Committee where they have veto rights. And at the time, the United States had veto rights. So that day, nothing much more happened. There were private conversations, there were briefings, and so on. And the next day, there was a meeting in the private office of the Secretary General, of Mr. Waldheim. And I think there is a photograph there of that meeting with Sir Eric, with Alan Hynek and myself and Claude Poher assembled to answer, whatever question Mr. Waldheim would have had or whatever suggestion. And the staff of the Secretary General had gone around to the member countries to know how they felt about a resolution. The idea was that we proposed a resolution for the UN to become engaged in the research or in the exchange of information among nations. Well, we were told the UN isn't there to do research. I mean, if you want to do research, you go to a university somewhere or a collective, effort from professors and scientists and so on, and they do research which could be supported by the UN. So so we came back saying, well, but the UN could coordinate exchanges among the different nations, which
Correct.
right now we were doing. I mean, I was exchanging data about the US with my French contemporaries, and the same thing was going on with Claude Poher. The reports from the French team, which was a government team, an official government team in France, which is still there, as you know, were available free to anybody who wanted them. And other countries were interested in doing the same thing and sharing information. Great Britain said that they didn't feel that this was apropos at the UN because it would cost too much money, which, if it was just a role of liaison, this could be done by one man. I mean, it could be done by somebody part-time, just having with a list of, you would take the document and you would send it to 120 countries. So there was no, and we responded that. We said, we're prepared to take over some of that role of a secretary, if you give us a mission to do that. And then it will cost nothing to the United Nations. In any case, it wouldn't cost more than, even if you wanted to do it for real, maybe a small full-time team of 4 or 5 people and a couple of secretaries and translators, interpreters. So then at the end of the day, the United States said, we're members of the Security Council, and we agree with the UK. And that was the end of the discussion. Grenada is a small island in the Caribbean Sea, and was not a voting member of the executive committee. So at that point, there were sort of backroom motions to draft something that would encourage the individual countries to share their data on the subject, which anybody could write that. But that did not have a stamp of the United Nations, but it was. It came from a meeting at the United Nations. It would be nice if different countries took it upon themselves to exchange information informally with interested scientists. That's essentially all we got. There were a couple of things drafted and approved, but that was purely secretarial maneuvers to save face, but it had no real application, certainly no political application. And remember, the committee that we dealt with was a political committee of the UN. Those are the people who make decisions.
Right, and then there's the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, the UNOOSA. So I've contacted them recently and asked why they have not taken the UAP topic seriously. And I have not heard a response yet. I've also followed up directly with the media team with the United Nations and their spokespeople to hear why this hasn't been taken seriously yet. Hence, when you were working with Grenada in the 1970s, trying to push this forward. And now we look at current events, and we have San Marino is an island and a country that has been interested in potentially hosting these types of forums and multiple UAP forums for the United Nations and working with them. And still, there's been so much pushback recently from it. So I guess the question I ask you now, seeing that, and I've heard this from multiple different people that have worked in the Pentagon, that they don't feel that the United Nations is the right place to collect data for the UAP topic for people around the world. I actually would dispute that immensely. I feel that the United Nations and the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs would be the perfect place for it. Do you still think United Nations should do this, or is this still now more of a defense topic? Or is it both?
At the time, we tried to find another way of continuing to exchange information, and so we tried to hear the reaction of different countries. There were several countries that, under the right conditions, could have supported a motion. But again, this was preempted by the UK and the US saying, voting against it, presenting a veto. He said, if this comes to a vote, we will veto it. So that stopped it. But India said, yes, we would be interested. France said, we already do it. We have this group, which is a civilian group. It's not classified. We don't classify UFO cases. And we have a small team to document that. and the reports are public around the world. So France would have supported that. There were a couple of other countries that I think Brazil, Brazil, as you know, has had a lot of felt a lot of impact from the phenomenon at different levels, and they were eager to have support from other countries on, how this phenomenon could be treated on a global. So we had those contacts and we maintained them and we continued to do that. But to the extent that it didn't come to a vote at all, that was, that was a moot point. So could it be done again? To really have an effective decision by the UN, you would again have to find one country. It's nice that there is a space committee, but the space committee is I don't want to say an informal group. It is a formal group, but it's not a group that has a vote, at the political committee. There has to be one country that gets up and presents something formal to the assembly, and the assembly will vote on it and will discuss it. So we would have to restart that process. Now, somewhat to my astonishment, I think I'm the only survivor of the team, certainly the American team, that presented there. Of course, fortunately, Dr. Poher is still alive, and we're still friends and still in touch with each other. But Dr. Hynek is gone. Lee Spiegel, as we said, died last year. I was hoping that Lee and I would go back to New York with a proposal under the right conditions, but we would have needed some encouragement from at least one country. As you may know, there were discussions with an independent republic in the Mediterranean that was, but that never culminated in a real formal proposal. I mean, it has to be very strong, has to be, all the members of that team have to be aligned on what it is we're going to present. And then you have to be able to network with other countries. Certainly today, I think that Argentina could be a supporter. I think France might be a supporter. There is a need. The need is more acute today than it was then. Then the consensus of the scientific community was that this was not an important subject. I mean, the Condon report, when it came out, in the late 60s, said that there was essentially nothing of importance to science. Now you would find that there would be very interested scientists would be keen to start a study that would be an international study. I think that the evidence is there that a single country, even a country as powerful as the United States, is not adequate to study the phenomenon on that scale. The United States is an important country, but it's less than 5% of the area of the globe. Okay, the other 95% is populated by other people. So if you do the statistics that a scientist would do, the United States is missing 95% of the phenomena. And I can show that with my files. Okay, that's true. Okay? So it's true that we have a very active press, very active media, and ways of knowing what's going on somewhere else through satellites and so on. So now it's probably not exactly 95%, but if you look at what the American public would report, you have to ask what proportion of the surface of the Earth is the American public. Well, the American public is on the East Coast and the West Coast. And then, there are people in around the Gulf, there are people in Texas, but they are concentrated in cities. When you fly from, your home in Los Angeles to your home in Toronto, if you kept looking out of the window and did statistics on how many deserts you've flown over, you would find that, the population is very concentrated, much more concentrated than, for example, people in Europe. We have a network of little villages all over the place. And so if somebody sees something in the US, it's a special thing, it's a special occasion. It's not statistically casual. So with that, the statistics are against the US dominating the knowledge about the phenomenon. We have extremely good ways of looking down from space and, of course, looking down from the air. But we know that very, very few reports from pilots ever make it into the databases. As you know, we just, ran a 2-year program on databases as part of the BAS project, and we know what the statistics look like. So it will need some sort of international effort, and it's difficult to do. It's difficult to do because, there are people who want to use it for discrimination, people who want to use it for intelligence, people who want to. So there would have to be guidelines, but we know how to do that. I remember the planetary weather map, effort back in the 60s, where all the countries were communicating data on temperature, pressure, the state of the weather, and so on for a whole year, and this resulted in a number of reports that could be used by every country.
I agree with you.
We know how to do it.
Yeah, there's so much data that can be used, but I'd like to go back to the defense question, or the aspect of that question, because defense says it's theirs. Like, it shouldn't be for the United Nations. Some people that have worked in defense say that the Department of Defense say that we don't think that the United Nations should have it. This is a defense topic. Do you think that it's mainly a defense topic?
Before deciding this, and I think there is something in the American culture, because the US is such a great continental power that things that come from the outside have to be examined as a potential threat. So there has always been, that's why the Air Force was involved at every step, because the phenomenon was primarily thought to be in the air. So the Air Force was the prime arbiter of whether there was a phenomenon and what kind of a phenomenon it was. The data that's being discussed right now in Washington comes essentially from the government, which is proper, and the armed forces and intelligence. Nobody has asked, the agriculture department, is there, what do your members think about UFOs? As you know, I've spent a lot of time talking to people out in the boonies, both in France and in South America and of course in the US, in many states, with farmers, going to where the traces were, or where an animal had died, or where there was something to see, and making notes. And that's essentially, what I thought. Where I thought I could serve my colleagues the best was by gathering that information and trying to reduce it to elementary statistics. And we try to go up a level from that and extract the secondary knowledge of that. And as you know, we went part of the way doing that with the BAS project. But this is not primarily, a threat to human life. It's true, and that has been said, the last few days. I've said that there were cases when people had died in connection with that, but they usually died as a consequence of being exposed to the phenomenon, but not by the phenomenon murdering them. My words have been taken somewhat out of context there. If you stand up in the open with a sword, over your head in a field during a storm, it's very likely you'll be killed by lightning. And the lightning doesn't intend to kill you. It's just that you're there at the wrong time. It's like standing in front of a locomotive. The locomotive, is a technology that's designed to move very fast and not stop anywhere. So, unfortunately, there are those cases, but generally speaking, the attitude of the phenomenon, for example, is reported by the Air Force towards our aircraft is one of either playing games with our aircraft, just, for example, moving around them, which is at high speed. This has been seen with rockets going up, and something coming from the horizon and spiraling around the rocket as the rocket goes up, okay? That has been filmed, okay? So this is obviously, if a phenomenon like this, whatever it is, was directed against the rocket, it could make the launch fail. And that, to my knowledge, didn't happen. The same thing with objects approaching aircraft. There are very few cases where it interfered dangerously with the aircraft. The case of Major Coyne, is an exception. But I had breakfast with Major Coyne the next day, okay? Which is something I like to do with witnesses, who've made a statement and so on. I stick around and I want to talk to them one-on-one. And they know that I've heard a lot of stories. So this is not for publicity. I don't record it, I said, what's happened to you in your private life since then? And he said that he had some sequelae in his sleep pattern, which is very common. He didn't report that. And that he had changed in his attitude. This is a middle-aged, army major who flies large helicopters for a living. Um, he said he felt that he was able to communicate with animals, that he
Oh,
would
wow.
see with animals. He would see a small animal or even an insect, crawling on the table, and that his consciousness was impacted by the presence of another form of life, even a much lower form of life, and he was stunned by that. I mean, he wasn't communicating, with the animals or the insects, but he felt that he had discovered a communication link at some level with every form of life around him. And that stunned him. He didn't know how to use it. He didn't know where that came from. But he thought of it as a consequence of what he had gone through.
His consciousness evolved, it sounds like.
Now, this is a tough guy. I mean, this is.
Yeah.
So you would find that if people took the time to just not just send a reporter and take some notes, or go there with a tape recorder and and get a statement from somebody and then go home. If they took the time to go back the next day, have breakfast with the witness and listen to what they had to say, but to me that was the most personally important thing I got from going to New York, from going to UN,
Wow.
was my profound respect for that army officer, what he went through, his astonishing experience. Again, there was silence. The silence in the room was extraordinary. It was probably the only time when there was silence in that room. Everybody was mesmerized by what this man had gone through. And we did nothing with it. We just
Yeah.
vetoed the whole thing and went home.
Yeah, I can hear that resentment in your
I
voice,
think next
Jacques.
time
Yeah.
we should start, if we have a chance, putting witnesses there, not scientists, not people looking for money for research, or not, uh, not, head of the university, not chairs of great universities. I mean, we know what they think. They've made statements. They have channels at their disposal if they have something to say. And they've said it, have places like your show where they can present, a graphic, structured statement about what they think and what they think should be done. But put the real human beings there. No offense intended with, the professors, but the UN needs to hear from witnesses from different countries, different cultures, who have something like that to say.
Yes, I was thinking the same thing when it comes to at least different cultures and different people around the world having similar experiences. And there obviously will be differences in those experiences, but some of the accounts will be similar, and the way that they feel and the emotional impact that it's had. I agree with you. I do say we forget sometimes that the human interest story and the human impact that this has is so amazing. And we would not have a phenomenon if we weren't alive. And it's very much a human thing. And it's a human thing to experience for some people. And maybe all of us, I don't have the ability to, or maybe don't realize we're experiencing it too. So I think data is important and it will always be important, but the people come first, because that's what makes the data is us observing it and seeing it and being around it. So I agree. And I really do hope that the United Nations, or even if it's one country that is deciding to come forward and collect data from around the world to help analyze and speak with other scientists and get a better handle on what's happening, would be important.
That was 1978. I was, I was essentially doing my PhD in AI. If I had to make the same speech today, I've learned a lot. I know the extent of the data. As you know, with the Bigelow project, we gathered the largest database, all in English, all structured for research, in existence. And this is not going to happen again very quickly, but we could use the experience of building this to build a global database where everybody could cooperate with some guidelines. And we know how to do it. I think we could go to Google or IBM and they would donate the computer time, and people would donate their time. I don't think that would be a burden to the budget of the United Nations. It could certainly be structured. We know how to do that. This is not 1978 anymore.
You're right. And less people, you would still have people that would be hired, but we have AI now to help organize and look at the data and do fast calculations in real time. So we'd have real evaluations in moments once we look at data from the past and the present. I think that the United Nations could, or even if it has to be one country. Recently I've sat with the Canadian Chief Science Advisor team in Ottawa, and we spoke about their recommendations to our Prime Minister, who now is Mark Carney, but previously was under Justin Trudeau. But now Mark Carney will have to make the decision of if a database will be created, and maybe the Canadian Space Agency will run that. But that would be a great example for us to present something to the Canadian side of the Space Agency or the Canadian Institute or a Science Advisory, and say, maybe we can start this database. Maybe we can collect this database and then present something to the United Nations to show as a best practice. We've done so much in Canada for so long around data collection and UFOs and the science behind UFOs, from Project Magnet to Project Second Story, that we have the capabilities to do it. And I think it just takes a country to push it forward. And we're very liberal thinking. So, I would hope, and, maybe I can try, but I think that it takes a country that's within the United Nations to be able to start those conversations. And we know we have lots of American partners and people in France, people in Japan. Grenada would probably maybe jump back on board, but we know we have lots of other countries that will support us in this initiative, I think.
If that is done, if we were to ask what mistake did we make?
Yes.
I think we were well prepared. I think we did an impressive presentation. I think we did not canvass the different nations. Of course, we didn't have the staff to do that, but we should have probed some of the major nations in advance, telling them we're going to do this. We have one member nation that is going to present it. What do you think? What do you need from us? How can we pave the way to an interesting discussion? There was no discussion, essentially. Once the UK and the US said it's too expensive, the UN can't afford to do that, that was the end of the... They never said it shouldn't be done. They only said the UN doesn't have the money to do it.
That's wild. Well, that's not a problem now. Well, it shouldn't be. because we have so many private organizations and institutes, more than there was ever in the 1970s. So you're right. It just takes a team to be able to bring up this conversation. And I do respect San Marino trying their best, and Paulo, who has been out there trying his best with San Marino to take this seriously. It will happen one day. I'm pretty sure of that. It will happen one day. I just hope that
it should not happen at a time of crisis.
I was just going to say that. My only fear is that the United Nations now will look to other countries and say, how do we create a communications report, or how do we communicate recommendations of how do we deal with these crises, or even contact? You know, there's so much the United Nations could do, from countries around the world, getting them together and saying that if we ever have some type of first contact, this is how we will react. And this is how all countries should react, or a recommendation on how they should react. That has been researched through scientists, has been collaborated with different countries. And that could take about a couple years to create that report when it comes to comms and communications. And then the second aspect, it would be collecting data yearly and sending out yearly or every 6 months, sending a report about what we see when it comes to objects and correlations, and looking at the past. I think it's and it would be so fun. I think that's the other thing. I don't think it would just be boring. I think for most of us, I don't know who loves UFOs and the topic, I think it would be one of the best experiences to be part of something that is collaborative around the world and put in recommendations that one day humanity might use. And I think that could change if we become how we connect with that other of what it is, and how we understand it, and what our approach to it, instead of being so reactive and scared. When it comes to a global conversation, we can debate if it's here or not, and if the government knows, but in the context of a global civilian perspective, and how people should feel, and how people should maybe feel inside, and potentially not be worried that because we do have some form of comms and something ready to go.
Well, that could be prepared, and now would be the time to start. And I certainly could, introduce your friend to my friends in Argentina, who have been trying to call attention to this on the international political level. That could be done.
I think that is an amazing next step, and I would love that. At least being able to connect even the Canadian side, or Canadian chief science advisors, with Argentina, and then talking to San Marino. And I know that we'd have a fair amount of even American support, potentially politically, but I think you're right. I think Argentina would be a great step to go forward. And then hopefully
French data is available.
Yes. Yeah. And even if the French the committees are still looking and would be of interest of it, I think we would have just a letter of recommendation and support to go to the General Assembly. This happens, the General Assembly happens every September, and I believe in New York City. So it's not too far away, and it is possible. So just takes one more team to push it forward.
Yes.
We'll get it one day.
Well, I hope, as the last surviving member of that American delegation, I would like to see that happen again.
Me too. Well, here's hoping so, Jacques. Thank you so much today for being rebelliously curious with me.
Thank you, Chrissy.